Have you ever been asked, what is your favorite World War II flare gun? Well, probably not, but I'm going to tell you why the answer to that question should be the Leuchtpistole 34. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about German flare gun history. The Germans exited World War I with a flare gun known to collectors as the Hebel, and it was a fine flare gun, but not without its problems. It was heavy and unwieldy, but its biggest issue was the fact that all of the parts had to be hand-fit during assembly. This, of course, severely limited its ability to be mass-produced. So in 1926, a new model was introduced. In this side-by-side comparison, you can see that the new version was obviously inspired by the Hebel, but had interchangeable parts and ergonomic upgrades. However, it would be nearly a decade until the needlessly long barrel and steel construction were done away with. Around 1935, flare guns began to be produced from duralumin, an aluminum alloy frequently used in aircraft production. This, in combination with the shorter barrel, made the flare gun much lighter and handier. Flare guns were produced in this configuration, with some minor modifications up until 1943. In 1943, due to material shortages, production was resumed in steel, as well as a new material, zinc. This was considered an interim solution until everyone could get tooled up for production of the new stamped steel model, the Leuchtpistole 42. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's take a look at my Leuchtpistole. Now, it's not uncommon to come across Leuchtpistole that have barrels or frames that have changed color. Normally, they'll be kind of shades of green or red, reddish orange. And that is a result of inconsistencies in the anodizing process. Some people think that exposure to sunlight or just age itself is what actually causes them to change colors. On mine, you'll notice that the barrel has changed color, but the frame, which was obviously anodized correctly, has not. Now let's take a look at the individual features. So starting at the bottom, we have a lanyard ring. I should mention that these weren't actually issued with a lanyard that was specifically intended for the Leuchtpistole. You'd have to source one from somewhere else if you wish to have it secured with a lanyard. And then above the lanyard ring, you can see there are just two very simple Bakelite grips. Now moving up a little bit further on the frame, the first thing you'll notice is a hole in the back right here. And that hole had a couple of purposes. First, it was used with a mounting device to ensure you were able to get a completely vertical shot with the flare gun. This was useful for people who were calculating measurements for artillery and stuff like that, where they'd use a completely vertical flare to measure wind direction and drift. Later on in the war, this was the mounting point for the stock used in the Sturmpistole conversion, and I've got a separate video on that if you'd like to watch it, but the Sturmpistole basically turned a standard Leuchtpistole into a standalone grenade launching system. Now on the back here we have our hammer, and this hammer is one of the big improvements over the Hebel. The Hebel had a much sharper spur on the hammer, and the hammer stuck out further from the frame in general, which made it easy to snag it on stuff. You can see this is nicely rounded off, it's more recessed into the frame of the gun. And this is actually the second version of hammer that was on these flare guns. The earlier ones were wider and actually covered the entire piece. They extended out to the edges of the frame right there. And finally, we have our loaded chamber indicator. It has a punch mark under it to keep it securely in place. I'll show you how this works later on. These were added in 1941, and if I had to guess, it was probably as a result of troop feedback who wrote into the manufacturers or told their superiors, hey, it'd be really nice to have a way to check if we had a cartridge in the barrel at night, or even during the day if you were on a stealthy mission, because opening these things up is pretty loud, as you'll see later on in the video. Now, the majority of Leuchtpistole will have a manufacturer's mark, date, and serial number stamped on the left side of the frame. Here we have the code for Irma Erfurt, AYF, and then under it 42, which is of course 1942. Now, a little bit further to the left, we have our serial number, one on the frame, and then one, if you can see it, right here in the corner, and that's on the barrel, and that is a complete serial number, but half of it is obscured by the frame, but it would be completely visible if you remove the barrel. All of the Waffenamt proof marks are going to be located on the right side of the frame and barrel. You can see some on both the barrel and the frame down there. And those are Waffenamt 280, which is the correct Waffenamt for Irma Erfurt. And finally, we have our trigger guard and the unlocking lever to get the flare gun open. These are made of steel as opposed to the aluminum that the rest of the flare gun is made from. This lever here is spring-loaded, and that's how you pop open the barrel, and I'll show you that here in a second. Alright, so let me show you how to actually use it. So you're going to take your thumb, put it on this part of the lever here. It's serrated, so you have a nice grip, and then just push it forward. And it pops right open. You can see it comes open quite violently. There is a spring in there that puts pressure on the barrel. So when you pull this forward, that spring's going to push it up and pop it right open. So here is the breech face. You can see a hole in the center for the firing pin, and then a little peg next to that, and that peg is for our loaded chamber indicator, so let's push it in. So if we push it in, you can see it protrude out the back like that, and that is how you would know if you had a cartridge in the chamber or not. Now here is a better look at that spring that puts pressure on the barrel. We have the lugs that actually lock the barrel into the frame, an extractor right here. And that's actually a pretty good view of the profile of the barrel. You can see the chamber here has a hexagonal shape to it to give it a little bit more strength when firing some of the many different types of ammunition of varying pressures that were available for the Leuchtpistole. So once you have a cartridge in the chamber, mine is of course still empty, you simply push the barrel back into place. And it locks in, and as soon as you cock the hammer, you are ready to go. This is a single action only design, so you have to pull the hammer back just like that, and there you go. That is how to load and fire your Leuchtpistole. Unfortunately, taking a look at the inner workings of the Leuchtpistole is outside the scope of this video. I'll put up a reference photo in case you're interested in what the insides look like. Fully disassembling one of these requires punching out multiple pins that have a nasty habit of breaking. There is also, of course, the risk of further marring the finish. These were not intended to be disassembled by the average soldier, and maintenance beyond basic cleaning was left to the unit Waffenmeister. Now I hope that after looking at all the features and examining the construction, you can see why I claim this is probably the best flare gun ever made. There really were no corners cut in its design and construction. But you're probably thinking, wouldn't the material, being aircraft-grade aluminum, and time spent machining these have been put to better use making things like aircraft? And you would be correct, but it would take until late 1943 for production to fully move away from the Model 34. But there was a reason for the initial complexity and quality of these flare guns. Flare pistols were issued to the Wehrmacht at a very high rate and were used extensively in relaying information, orders, and warnings. And as far as I can tell, the Germans relied on flare guns much more heavily than other militaries of the time. This is why the quality and construction mattered so much. Making them out of aluminum ensured that they wouldn't be too much of a burden to the average soldier who had to carry one in addition to his service weapon and other equipment. Now much more can be said about the Leuchtpistole, including the naming conventions, different manufacturers, and the huge variety of ammunition used, but we'll save that for another day. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please consider subscribing to see more videos about Militaria. Thank you.